May 13, 1846. The U.S. Congress just declared war on Mexico. The vote? 174-14 in the House, 40-2 in the Senate. Overwhelming support for a war that would add 525,000 square miles to the United States, California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. That's almost 1/3 of what America is today. But here's the thing nobody talks about. This war was built on a lie. President James K. Polk told Congress that Mexico had invaded our territory and shed American blood upon American soil. Except the American soil he was talking about was disputed territory that Mexico still claimed. Polk deliberately provoked the war, moved troops into contested land, waited for Mexico to respond, then used that response as justification for invasion. Even Abraham Lincoln, then a freshman congressman, called out Polk's deception. He demanded to know the exact spot where American blood was shed, questioning whether it was actually American territory. Ulysses S. Grant, who fought in the war as a young lieutenant, later called it one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. And yet, despite the controversy, despite the lies, despite the moral questions, America won. Decisively, brutally. Mexico lost half its territory. The U.S. became a continental power, and the seeds were planted for the Civil War that would tear America apart just 13 years later. This is the Mexican-American War, the war of manifest destiny. The war that gave us the American Southwest. The war that proved America could take what it wanted. And the war that forced the nation to confront an impossible question. If slavery couldn't expand into these new territories, would the Union even survive? To understand this war, you need to understand one phrase: manifest destiny. It was the belief, widely held by white Americans in the 1840s, that the United States was destined by God to expand across the entire North American continent. From sea to shining sea. It didn't matter who was already there. Native Americans, Mexicans, whoever, they were obstacles to progress. This wasn't just racist ideology, though it absolutely was that. It was also economic ambition. Americans wanted land. They wanted resources. They wanted ports on the Pacific. And they were willing to take them by force. The story really begins in 1821, when Mexico won independence from Spain. At that time, Mexico controlled a massive territory that included not just modern-day Mexico, but also Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. It was huge, and it was very sparsely populated. Mexico had a problem. They needed people to settle these northern territories, especially Texas, which was vulnerable to Comanche raids and American encroachment. So they invited American settlers to move to Texas. The deal was simple. You can have cheap land, but you have to become Mexican citizens, convert to Catholicism, and, most importantly, no slavery. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829. American settlers agreed to the terms, then promptly ignored them. By the 1830s, American settlers in Texas outnumbered Mexicans 10-1. They kept their slaves. They refused to convert. They didn't learn Spanish. They were basically Americans living in Mexican territory and pretending Mexico didn't exist. Mexico tried to regain control. In 1830, they banned further American immigration to Texas and stationed troops there. It didn't work. The American settlers were already too entrenched. Tensions boiled over in 1835 when the settlers rebelled. This became the Texas Revolution. In 1836, Texas declared independence. The famous Battle of the Alamo happened, where 200 Texan defenders were killed by Mexican forces under General Santa Anna. "Remember the Alamo" became the rallying cry. A few weeks later, Sam Houston led Texan forces to victory at the Battle of San Jacinto, capturing Santa Anna and forcing him to sign a treaty recognizing Texas independence. But here's the catch. Mexico never actually accepted that treaty. They argued Santa Anna signed it under duress while a prisoner. Legally, Mexico still considered Texas a rebellious province, not an independent nation. This would matter a lot. Texas wanted to join the United States. But there was a problem. Texas allowed slavery. If Texas joined as a slave state, it would upset the delicate balance between free and slave states in Congress. Northern states opposed annexation. So for 9 years, Texas remained an independent republic, the Lone Star Republic. Then James K. Polk became president in 1845. Polk was a hardcore expansionist. He ran on a platform of territorial growth. He wanted Texas. He wanted California. He wanted it all. And he was willing to lie, cheat, and provoke a war to get it. In December 1845, Polk annexed Texas by joint resolution of Congress, avoiding the Senate's 2/3 treaty requirement. Mexico was furious. They had warned that annexation would mean war. They severed diplomatic relations with the U.S. immediately. But Polk wasn't done. He sent diplomat John Slidell to Mexico City with an offer. The U.S. would pay $25 million for California and New Mexico, plus assume $3 million in debts Mexico owed to American citizens. And oh yeah, the U.S. would also claim the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas, not the Nueces River, which had been the traditional boundary. Mexico refused to even meet with Slidell. The government was in chaos. Multiple coups, weak leadership, bankruptcy. Selling half the country to the Americans? Political suicide. No Mexican leader could agree to that and survive. So Polk moved to Plan B, provoke a war. In January 1846, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to move U.S. troops into the disputed territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. This was land Mexico still claimed. Taylor built a Fort Texas, right across the river from the Mexican town of Matamoros. It was a deliberate provocation. On April 25, 1846, Mexican forces attacked a U.S. patrol in the disputed zone. 11 Americans were killed. Polk had his excuse. On May 11, 1846, he told Congress that Mexico had invaded our territory and shed American blood upon the American soil. War was declared 2 days later, except it wasn't American soil. It was disputed territory. Polk knew it. Mexico knew it. A lot of Americans knew it. But the war machine was already in motion. The U.S. war plan was aggressive and multi-pronged. Attack Mexico from 3 directions simultaneously. Northern Mexico, General Zachary Taylor would invade from Texas to central Mexico. General Winfield Scott would land at Veracruz and march to Mexico City, California, and New Mexico. Colonel Stephen Kearny would capture the southwest. Let's start with Taylor. Old Rough and Ready was a career soldier, popular with his troops, not much of a strategist but tough as nails. In May 1846, he won the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, forcing Mexican troops back across the Rio Grande. These were the first major battles, and they went heavily in America's favor. Better artillery, better training, better logistics. In September 1846, Taylor captured the city of Monterrey after a brutal 3-day battle. The city was heavily fortified. Mexican forces, led by General Pedro de Ampudia, fought house to house. Taylor's forces suffered significant casualties, about 500 dead or wounded, but eventually took the city. Taylor, trying to be magnanimous, allowed the Mexican army to retreat with their weapons. This pissed off Polk, who wanted total destruction of Mexican forces. The relationship between Polk and Taylor was already strained. Taylor was a Whig, the opposing political party, and Polk worried he might use military success to run for president. Spoiler, he did, and won in 1848. So Polk started diverting Taylor's best troops to General Winfield Scott's campaign. Despite being undermanned, Taylor won his most famous victory in February 1847 at the Battle of Buena Vista. Mexican General Santa Anna, yes, the same guy from the Alamo, led 15,000 troops against Taylor's 5,000. It should have been a massacre, but Taylor's artillery and disciplined infantry held the line. After 2 days of fighting, Santa Anna retreated. Taylor became a national hero. Polk was furious. Meanwhile, in the West, things were moving fast. Colonel Stephen Kearny led the Army of the West, about 1,700 troops, from Kansas to New Mexico. In August 1846, he captured Santa Fe without firing a shot. The Mexican governor fled. New Mexico was now under U.S. control. Kearny then marched to California, where things got complicated. California had already been in revolt. American settlers, encouraged by U.S. Army officer John C. Fremont, had declared the Bear Flag Republic in June 1846, an independent California. When Kearny arrived, he found that U.S. naval forces under Commodore Robert Stockton had already taken San Diego and Los Angeles. But the Californios, Mexican residents of California, fought back. In late 1846, they recaptured Los Angeles and San Diego. Kearny's forces, exhausted from the desert crossing, fought the Battle of San Pasqual in December 1846, a rare American defeat where Kearny's troops were mauled by California Lancers. Eventually, combined U.S. forces retook Southern California in early 1847. By January 1847, California was firmly under U.S. control. Now, the big campaign, Winfield Scott's march to Mexico City. Scott was the opposite of Taylor, a brilliant strategist, vain, obsessed with protocol and military precision. Polk didn't like him either. Scott was also a Whig, but Scott was the best general America had. In March 1847, Scott launched the first major amphibious assault in U.S. military history, landing 12,000 troops at Veracruz, Mexico's main port on the Gulf Coast. The city was heavily fortified. Scott didn't want to storm it and take heavy casualties, so he laid siege. He bombarded Veracruz for days with artillery and naval guns. Civilians died. Buildings were destroyed. On March 29, 1847, the city surrendered. Then Scott did something brilliant. Instead of marching straight into the desert where guerrillas and disease could pick his army apart, he followed the same route Hernán Cortés had taken when he conquered the Aztec Empire in 1519, inland through the mountains to Mexico City. It was a psychological move. Scott was literally retracing the steps of the Spanish conquest. Santa Anna tried to stop him. In April 1847, the Mexican army fortified the mountain pass at Cerro Gordo. They had the high ground, artillery positions, thousands of troops. It should have been a killing ground for the Americans. But Scott sent engineers, including a young Captain Robert E. Lee, to scout a flanking route through the hills. The Americans attacked from an unexpected direction, routed the Mexican forces, and captured tons of supplies and artillery. Santa Anna barely escaped. Scott kept advancing. In August 1847, his army reached the outskirts of Mexico City. A series of brutal battles followed. Battle of Contreras, August 19th to 20th. U.S. forces overwhelmed Mexican positions. Battle of Churubusco, August 20th. One of the bloodiest fights of the war. The Mexican army, reinforced by the San Patricio Battalion, Irish-American deserters who switched sides, fought fiercely. The U.S. won but took heavy casualties. Battle of Molino del Rey, September 8th. A costly American victory. U.S. forces thought the building was a cannon foundry. It wasn't. They attacked anyway and lost over 100 dead for no strategic gain. Battle of Chapultepec, September 13th. The final assault. Chapultepec Castle was a hilltop fortress defended by Mexican military cadets. Teenagers, really, the Niños Héroes, boy heroes, fought to the death rather than surrender. According to legend, the last cadet wrapped himself in the Mexican flag and jumped off the castle rather than let it be captured. They're national heroes in Mexico to this day. On September 14, 1847, U.S. forces entered Mexico City. They raised the American flag over the National Palace. The Mexican government collapsed. Santa Anna resigned and fled. The war was effectively over. Mexico was defeated, occupied, humiliated, but they still had to negotiate. The U.S. sent diplomat Nicholas Trist to work out a peace treaty. Polk's instructions were clear. Take California, take New Mexico, and make the Rio Grande the border of Texas. And make Mexico pay for it, literally. Trist negotiated the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848. The terms Mexico ceded 525,000 square miles of territory to the U.S., what would become California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. The Rio Grande became the official border of Texas. The U.S. paid Mexico $15 million and assumed $3.25 million in debts owed to American citizens. Mexicans living in the ceded territories could choose to become U.S. citizens or return to Mexico. Most stayed. Their property rights were supposed to be protected. They weren't. Mexico lost 55% of its territory. The U.S. gained enough land to eventually create 7 new states. It was the largest territorial expansion in American history outside of the Louisiana Purchase. But the cost? Let's talk numbers. Military casualties. U.S. 13,300 dead. Only 1,700 from combat. The rest from disease, dysentery, yellow fever, malaria. Mexico 25,000 dead. Estimates vary. Record keeping was poor. Financial cost. U.S. spent about $100 million on the war, equal to $3 billion today. Mexico's economy was devastated. Bankrupt, infrastructure destroyed, government in chaos. Moral cost. Even in 1846, many Americans knew the war was unjust. The Massachusetts legislature called it a war of conquest. Abolitionist Frederick Douglass condemned it as a plot to expand slavery. Writer Henry David Thoreau refused to pay taxes to support the war and went to jail. His essay Civil Disobedience came from that experience. Ulysses S. Grant, who fought in the war, later wrote in his memoirs, "I was bitterly opposed to the measure, and to this day regard the war as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation." And then there's the slavery issue. The new territories reignited the debate. Would they be slave states or free states? In 1846, Congressman David Wilmot proposed the Wilmot Proviso, a ban on slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. Passed the House but failed in the Senate. The fight over the Wilmot Proviso exposed the deep divide between North and South. It led directly to the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the collapse of the Whig Party, and eventually the Civil War. Mexico never forgot. The war is taught in Mexican schools as a national tragedy, La Invasion Estadounidense, the American invasion. The loss of territory is a wound that still shapes Mexican identity. There's a reason why many Mexicans say, "We didn't cross the border crossed us." One of the strangest and most tragic stories of the war. The San Patricio Battalion, St. Patrick's Battalion. These were U.S. soldiers, mostly Irish Catholic immigrants, who deserted the U.S. Army and fought for Mexico. Why did they switch sides? Irish immigrants faced brutal discrimination in the U.S. Army. Protestant officers mocked their Catholic faith. They were given the worst assignments, beaten, denied promotions. And then they were sent to fight a Catholic nation, Mexico, in what many saw as a Protestant war of aggression. Mexican agents actively recruited them. They offered land, money, and the promise of respect. Hundreds of Irish and German immigrants deserted. They formed their own battalion under the Mexican flag, a green banner with a harp and the words, "Erin go Braff, Ireland forever." The San Patricios fought hard. They were skilled artillerymen. At the Battle of Churubusco, they defended a key position against overwhelming U.S. forces. When their ammunition ran out, they kept fighting hand to hand. When the battle was lost and the Mexican forces surrendered, the San Patricios were captured. The U.S. Army showed no mercy. Desertion in wartime meant death. About 50 members of the battalion were court-martialed and executed, the largest mass execution in U.S. military history. They were hanged in front of Chapultepec Castle while the battle was still raging, forced to watch the American flag raised over the castle as they died. In Mexico, the San Patricios are heroes. There are monuments to them, streets named after them. Every year on September 12th, Mexico honors their sacrifice. In the US, they're mostly forgotten, erased from the narrative of a war America would rather not examine too closely. The Mexican-American War lasted less than 2 years, but its consequences shaped the next century of American history. 1. Manifest destiny achieved. The U.S. now stretched from Atlantic to Pacific. The dream of a continental empire was realized. This victory convinced Americans they could take whatever they wanted. It set the template for future interventions in Latin America. If diplomacy failed, use force. 2. The Civil War became inevitable. The Wilmot Proviso fight proved that slavery couldn't be compromised. Every new territory meant a new battle, free or slave. The Compromise of 1850 delayed the reckoning, but the tensions kept building. Many of the generals who fought in Mexico, Grant, Lee, Sherman, Jackson, Meade, would face each other again in the Civil War. 3. Mexico was broken. The loss of half its territory devastated Mexico's economy and pride. Political instability followed. Between 1848 and 1860, Mexico had 20 different presidents. The weakness invited foreign intervention. France invaded in 1861 and installed Emperor Maximilian. Though that didn't last, it showed how vulnerable Mexico had become. 4. The Native Americans lost again. The treaty promised to protect Native Americans in the ceded territories. Didn't happen. The influx of American settlers, the California Gold Rush, which started just months after the treaty was signed, and U.S. military campaigns wiped out or displaced most native tribes in the Southwest. The Navajo, Apache, and Comanche would fight brutal wars against U.S. expansion for decades. 5. American imperialism was born. This war proved the U.S. could project military power beyond its borders. It gave America the confidence to expand further, annexing Hawaii, taking the Philippines, intervening in Central America. The ideology of manifest destiny evolved into justifications for global empire. 6. The myth of the good war was challenged. The Revolutionary War was about freedom. The Civil War was about union and ending slavery. World War II was about defeating fascism. But the Mexican-American War? It was about conquest, land, power. It forced Americans to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes we're the bad guys. The Mexican-American War wasn't a necessary war or a defensive war. It was a war of choice, built on lies, driven by greed, and justified by racist ideology. And it worked. America got everything it wanted. The question is, at what cost? Mexico lost half its territory. The U.S. gained an empire. And 13 years later, that empire nearly tore itself apart over the question it had been avoiding all along. Can a nation founded on liberty and equality expand through conquest and slavery? The Mexican-American War didn't answer that question, but it made the Civil War inevitable. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on February 2, 1848. The war was over. America had won. But let's be brutally honest about what winning actually meant. The United States paid Mexico $15 million for 525,000 square miles of land. Do the math, that's about $28 per square mile. For context, the U.S. had paid France $15 million for the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which was 827,000 square miles. Mexico got the same price for 40% less land. And unlike the Louisiana Purchase, which was a voluntary sale, this was a treaty signed at gunpoint with an occupied capital. Mexico lost California, and just 9 days after the treaty was signed, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill. The California Gold Rush began in 1849. Hundreds of thousands of people flooded into California. Within 2 years, California became a state. The gold pulled from California in the 1850s was worth over $2 billion in 1850s dollars. Mexico lost that, all of it. The human cost? 13,283 Americans died. But here's the thing nobody mentions, only 1,733 died in combat. The rest, over 11,000, died from disease. Dysentery, yellow fever, typhoid, malaria. The U.S. Army had no idea how to manage sanitation in a tropical campaign. Soldiers drank contaminated water, lived in filth, and died in agony far from home. For Mexico, estimates range from 25,000 to 50,000 dead, but records are incomplete. Nobody bothered to count Mexican civilian casualties. And then there's the darker legacy that nobody wants to talk about. The Mexicans who stayed became second-class citizens in their own land. The treaty promised that Mexicans in the ceded territories could keep their property and become U.S. citizens with full rights. That lasted about 5 minutes. American settlers and speculators used legal tricks, dubious land claims, and outright fraud to seize Mexican-owned ranches. In California, a law required landowners to prove their ownership in American courts, a process that cost thousands of dollars and took years. Most Mexican families went bankrupt trying to defend titles to land their families had owned for generations. By the 1870s, they'd lost most of it. In New Mexico and Texas, it was worse. Mexicans, now Mexican Americans, faced systematic discrimination. They were barred from whites-only establishments, lynched by mobs, driven off their land by violence. Between 1848 and 1928, more Mexicans were lynched in the Southwest than any other group except African Americans. This isn't ancient history. This is living memory for some families. The war also destroyed the political balance that had kept slavery contained. Remember the Missouri Compromise of 1820? It drew a line across the country. Slavery allowed south of 36 degrees 30 minutes, banned north of it. That compromise held for 30 years. The Mexican-American War shattered it. California, Utah, New Mexico, these territories didn't fit the old formula. Should they be slave or free? In 1850, Congress tried the Compromise of 1850. California enters as a free state, but the other territories get popular sovereignty. Let the settlers vote on slavery. Sounds democratic, right? It led to Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers literally went to war with each other in the 1850s. Towns were burned. People were murdered. John Brown started his violent crusade against slavery there. The Compromise of 1850 also included the Fugitive Slave Act, which required Northerners to return escaped slaves to the South. This radicalized Northern abolitionists like never before. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in response. The Republican Party was founded in 1854 specifically to stop slavery's expansion into the new territories. Abraham Lincoln rose to prominence arguing that the founders never intended for slavery to spread. Every step toward the Civil War can be traced back to the land taken from Mexico. The question wasn't if the Union would split, it was when. Ulysses S. Grant, who fought in Mexico as a lieutenant and later became the Union's commanding general in the Civil War, saw the connection clearly. In his memoirs, written near the end of his life, he wrote, "The Southern Rebellion was largely the outgrowth of the Mexican War. Nations, like individuals, are punished for their transgressions. We got our punishment in the most sanguinary and expensive war of modern times." Grant believed the Civil War was divine punishment for the Mexican-American War. Over 600,000 Americans died in the Civil War, more than all other American wars combined up to that point. If Grant was right, then the real cost of Manifest Destiny wasn't $15 million and 13,000 dead. It was 600,000 dead and a nation torn apart. And what about Mexico? Mexico didn't just lose land. It lost identity. The country that had won independence from Spain in 1821 with dreams of being a great power was humiliated, occupied, and stripped of half its territory in less than 30 years. The psychological wound never healed. Mexican politics descended into chaos. Between 1848 and 1860, Mexico had over 20 different presidents. Coups, revolts, bankruptcy, corruption, the government couldn't stabilize. This weakness invited foreign intervention. In 1861, France invaded Mexico and installed Maximilian of Austria as emperor. It took years of fighting and pressure from the US after the Civil War ended, to drive the French out and execute Maximilian in 1867. The territorial loss also created a permanent grievance. Mexicans didn't forget that California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, these were Mexican lands taken by force.
Teres Asain in México, pobre México, tan lejos de Dios y tan cerca de los Estados Unidos, por México.
So far from God and so close to the United States. The war proved that proximity to American power was dangerous. Even today, the phrase "Remember 1847" carries weight in Mexico the same way "Remember the Alamo" does in Texas. Except the meanings are opposite. For Texans, the Alamo represents heroic resistance. For Mexicans, 1847 represents invasion, occupation, and loss. Every year on September 13th, Mexico honors the Niños Héroes, the teenage military cadets who died defending Chapultepec Castle. They're taught in schools as martyrs. Statues of them stand across Mexico City. Their sacrifice symbolizes Mexico's refusal to surrender its dignity even when it lost the war. And here's the bitter irony. The border moved, but the people didn't. Thousands of Mexicans woke up one day in 1848 and found themselves living in America without ever moving. Their families had been there for generations, long before any Americans arrived. The treaty promised them citizenship and property rights. Both promises were broken. This is why many Mexican Americans say, "We didn't cross the border crossed us." So who really won the Mexican-American War? If you measure victory by land, America won decisively. The continental United States, as we know it today, was essentially completed by this war. Manifest destiny was achieved. Ocean to ocean, the U.S. became a continental power positioned to become a global superpower. If you measure victory by morality, nobody won. This was a war of aggression, provoked by lies, waged for conquest, and justified by racism. Even many Americans at the time knew it. Henry David Thoreau went to jail rather than pay taxes to fund it. Abraham Lincoln challenged Polk's justifications. Frederick Douglass called it a slaveholder's plot. Years later, Ulysses S. Grant called it one of the most unjust wars ever fought. If you measure victory by long-term consequences, America might have lost. The territories taken from Mexico became the battleground for the slavery debate that tore the nation apart. The Civil War killed more Americans than the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, and Mexican-American War combined by a factor of 10. The racial hierarchies established in the conquered territories created systems of oppression that lasted generations and still echo today in debates over immigration, citizenship, and who belongs in America. And the biggest losers? The people who were already there. The Mexicans who became second-class citizens in their own homeland. The Native Americans, Navajo, Apache, Comanche, Pueblo, who lost their lands again, this time to American settlers backed by the U.S. Army. The California tribes nearly wiped out during the gold rush. The enslaved people who saw slavery's potential expansion into new territories, prolonging their bondage. The Mexican-American War is America's most successful war of conquest. It's also America's most morally indefensible war. And maybe that's why it gets so little attention in American history classes. It doesn't fit the narrative. It's not a war of liberation or defense or even reluctant necessity. It's a war where America played the role of empire, aggressive, expansionist, willing to use military force to take what it wanted. The war proved something uncomfortable. Manifest destiny wasn't destiny. It was a choice to provoke, a choice to invade, a choice to conquer, and choices have consequences. 13 years after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, those consequences came due. The nation that had stretched itself from sea to sea found itself unable to hold together. The empire built on conquest and compromise collapsed into civil war. And all the land, all the gold, all the territory. None of it could prevent 600,000 Americans from killing each other over the question the Mexican-American War had forced but never answered. Can a nation founded on the idea that all men are created equal expand through conquest, slavery, and subjugation? The answer, written in blood from 1861 to 1865, was no. The Mexican-American War didn't give America its destiny. It gave America a reckoning, and we're still dealing with it today.